dog brought home lion cubs. What happened next will break your heart. The Montana wilderness held its breath after the season's first heavy rain, droplets still clinging to pine needles and fern fronds like scattered diamonds. The air carried that particular scent of renewal mixed with decay earth turned fresh. Fallen leaves, beginning their slow transformation back to soil. Harold Mackenzie stood at the threshold of his weathered cabin, inhaling deeply as he always did before his evening rounds. The ritual had become sacred over the years, a moment of communion with the wilderness that had been his home for 37 years. His calloused hands gripped the porch railing, worn smooth by decades of similar contemplative moments, while his experienced eyes scanned the tree line for any signs of unusual activity. The forest had been his teacher, his companion, and his sanctuary since the day he'd first arrived, as a broken man seeking refuge from a world that had become too cruel, too fast, too disconnected from the natural rhythms that sustained all life. Here, among the towering pines and ancient oaks, he'd learned to read the subtle language of the wilderness, the way shadows fell differently when weather was approaching, how bird calls changed in the presence of predators, the significance of deer tracks that appeared overnight along familiar paths. But tonitva different, there was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the departing storm clouds, a tension that made the hair on his arms stand on end despite the mild temperature. Even the usual evening chorus of insects seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath, in anticipation of something momentous. Harold's weathered face, lined by years of sun and wind, reflected a lifetime of solitary contemplation. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, his flannel shirt soft from countless washings, his work boots bearing the scars of thousands of miles, walked through untamed terrain. At 73, he moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that in the wilderness, every step mattered. Every decision carried weight. Buddy's bark shattered the evening stillness like gunfire, a sound that sent ice through Harold's veins and caused every muscle in his body to tense with alarm. In all their 8 years together, the Siberian husky had never produced such a noise. Desperate, urgent, almost human in its distress. The bark echoed from somewhere deep in the forest. Beyond the familiar paths Harold walked daily, carrying with it a note of panic that spoke of mortal danger. Without hesitation, Harold grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the porch rail, its familiar weight reassuring in his palm. He also snatched his emergency backpack, a habit ingrained by years of wilderness, living and plunged into the woods, his worn boots finding purchase on the rain-slicked earth with the confidence of long practice. The forest seemed denser than usual, shadows pooling between ancient trunks like spilled ink. Harold's flashlight beam danced across familiar landmarks that looked alien in the strange light. The lightning struck oak where he'd once sheltered during a blizzard, the creek bed that ran full only after heavy rains, the old deer trail that wound deeper into the wilderness like a thread, connecting him to something primordial and wild. Buddy's barking grew louder, more frantic, guiding Harold through increasingly thick underbrush that caught at his flannel shirt and work pants. Thorns snagged his sleeves, low branches scraped his face, and more than once he had to duck under fallen logs that blocked the narrow animal trails he followed. The sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the forest stillness, punctuated only by the distant desperation in his dog's voice. Harold's mind raced through possibilities as he pushed deeper into the woods. In 37 years of wilderness living, he'd encountered most of what the Montana forest could offer: bears protecting cubs, injured deer trapped in deadfall, lost hikers requiring rescue. But Buddy's tone suggested something beyond ordinary forest emergencies. There was a quality to the barking that spoke of life and death, of innocence under threat, of something that demanded immediate intervention. When Harold reached the fallen giant, a massive ponderosa pine that had succumbed to age, and the recent storm creating a natural barrier across the trail, he stopped short, his breath coming in sharp gasps from the difficult journey. The The beam of his flashlight illuminated a scene that defied immediate comprehension, something so unexpected that his mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. Beneath the twisted root system of the fallen tree, something moved in the shadows. Not something several, somethings. The forest floor seemed alive with dark, scurrying shapes, and above their chittering came another sound that made Harold's heart clench. With sudden understanding, the terrified mewling of something very young and very afraid. Buddy emerged from the chaos like a warrior from battle. His usually pristine coat matted with mud and blood. The husky's brilliant blue eyes blazed with protective fury as he lunged at the swarm of forest rats that had gathered around the trapped creatures like vultures around carrion. His powerful jaws snapped shut repeatedly, his growls reverberating through the hollow space beneath the roots. With primal intensity, the rats, more than Harold had ever seen in one place, scattered and regrouped with the persistence of creatures sensing easy prey. They were large, aggressive specimens, their dark fur glistening with moisture from the recent rain, their red eyes reflecting Harold's flashlight beam like tiny demons. But Buddy fought with the determination of a creature protecting its own young, his movements fluid and deadly. Despite the wounds, Harold could see accumulating on his legs and muzzle. Harold watched in amazement as his dog, wounded and exhausted, began to dig carefully through the root system with his snout. Buddy's movements were deliberate and gentle, despite his obvious pain, working to extract whatever lay trapped beneath the natural prison. Blood dripped from several bite wounds on his face, but the dog's focus never wavered from his self-appointed rescue mission. When the first small form emerged, Harold's world tilted on its axis, reality, shifting in a way that left him questioning his own senses. A lion cub, no bigger than a house cat, hung limp in Buddy's gentle mouth. Its golden fur was matted with dirt and moisture, tiny ribs visible beneath the thin coat, its miniature paws hanging motionless in the cool air. The creature was so small, so impossibly fragile, that Harold's first instinct was to assume it was already dead. Another casualty of the wilderness's casual cruelty. Before Harold could fully process what he was seeing, Buddy had returned to his excavation, his powerful shoulders working as he carefully widened the opening beneath the roots. Moments later, he emerged with a second cub, this one smaller still but showing more signs of life. Tiny paws batting weakly at the air, a barely audible mewl escaping its miniature throat. He knew asking about how the two cubs appeared in this area was a waste of time. It was obvious that they were being trafficked by humans. Harold knelt in the damp earth, his hands shaking as he accepted the precious cargo from his dog. The cubs were impossibly small, their eyes still blue with youth, a detail that told Harold they were very young. Indeed, possibly only weeks old, their mewls were heartbreakingly weak, the sound of creatures who had been crying for help for far too long without response. How they had come to be trapped beneath a fallen tree in the Montana wilderness was a mystery that would have to wait for another time. Right now, they needed warmth, safety, and immediate medical attention. Harold's veterinary training from his younger days, a lifetime ago, when he'd worked with domestic animals, in a world that now seemed like a distant dream, came flooding back with crystalline clarity. The journey back to the cabin passed in a blur of careful steps and whispered reassurances. Harold cradled both cubs against his chest, feeling their rapid heartbeats against his ribs, their tiny bodies so light they seemed almost incorporeal. Buddy limped alongside, his protective instincts still on high alert despite his injuries. Every few steps, the dog would turn to check their back trail, ensuring they weren't being followed by predators, drawn to the scent of vulnerable young. The forest seemed different on the return journey, as if the rescue had changed something fundamental about Harold's relationship with the wilderness. Familiar landmarks took on new significance. Ordinary sounds carried deeper meaning, and the very air seemed charged with the possibility of miracle and transformation. Inside the warm cabin, Harold's hands moved with practiced efficiency, As his veterinary training reasserted itself, he prepared a makeshift nest near the fireplace, using old blankets and towels to create a warm, secure environment that would serve as intensive care for his unexpected patients. The larger cub, whom Harold instinctively named Rusty for his slightly reddish coat, showed signs of dehydration, but appeared otherwise healthy. The smaller cub, Milo, Harold decided, remembering a character from an old book about unlikely friendships, was more concerning. His breathing was shallow, his body temperature dangerously low, his responses sluggish. Throughout that first night, Harold maintained a careful vigil, drawing on every piece of knowledge he'd accumulated during his years as a veterinary assistant in what felt like another lifetime. He fed the cubs with an eyedropper, offering warm milk mixed with nutrients, monitoring their temperature and breathing with the intensity of a physician treating human patients. He checked their gums for signs of circulation, listened to their hearts with an old stethoscope, and watched for any changes in their condition that might indicate improvement or decline. But it was Buddy who provided the most crucial care, demonstrating an understanding of the cub's needs that went beyond anything Harold had ever witnessed in domestic animals. The injured dog positioned himself near the makeshift den, his large body creating a windbreak, an additional source of warmth. When the cubs whimpered in fear or cold, Buddy would shift closer, his presence somehow communicating safety to these creatures. From an entirely different world, Harold found himself marveling at his dog's intuitive understanding of what the cubs needed. Buddy seemed to recognize that these were babies requiring protection. Despite their alien scent and strange appearance, there was no aggression, no territorial behavior, only a gentle acceptance that spoke of intelligence and compassion that transcended species boundaries. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Harold witnessed something that would forever change his understanding of interspecies bonds. Rusty, the larger and more confident of the cubs, had crept close to Buddy's side during the night. Milo, weaker but more spirited, had somehow managed to wedge himself between Buddy's front paws, his tiny body rising and falling with each of the dog's breaths. The three animals, dog and lion, slept peacefully together, their breathing synchronized, their trust absolute. Harold sat in his rocking chair, watching this impossible scene, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he realized he was witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The days that followed established a routine born of necessity and nurtured by an inexplicable connection between the unlikely family. Harold documented everything in his journal, partly from scientific curiosity and partly from a growing certainty that he was witnessing something extraordinary that deserved careful recording for posterity. Each entry became more detailed, more wonder-filled, as he observed behaviors that defied conventional understanding of animal relationships. Buddy had appointed himself chief caretaker of the cubs, a role he embraced with touching dedication. The dog's schedule revolved entirely around the needs of his charges, and he seemed to have developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate what they required before they even expressed the need. Feeding time became a carefully orchestrated dance that revealed the depth of Buddy's commitment to his new family. Harold would prepare the cubs' meals, ground meat, and supplements, but it was Buddy who often delivered the food. The dog would carry each morsel carefully in his mouth, transferring it to the cubs with infinite patience, his movements gentle and precise. Harold noticed that Buddy often gave away portions of his own meals, ensuring the cubs had enough, even when his own bowl remained half empty. When Harold tried to give Buddy additional food to compensate, the dog would inevitably share that as well, creating a cycle of generosity that spoke to something profound about the nature of love and sacrifice. Milo's recovery proved more challenging than Rusty's, a struggle that revealed both the smaller cub's vulnerability and the extraordinary measures Buddy would take to ensure no member of their family was left behind. The smaller cub had clearly suffered from malnutrition before their rescue, and his movements were unsteady and weak. His limbs trembled with effort when he tried to walk, and he tired easily during even the shortest excursions around the cabin. But rather than leave his struggling companion behind, Buddy adapted his own behavior to accommodate Milo's limitations with a patience that moved Harold to tears. On multiple occasions, when the cubs began to explore the cabin, Milo would grasp Buddy's tail with his tiny paws, allowing himself to be guided around obstacles. Buddy would pause frequently, looking back to ensure his small charge was keeping up, and would lie down whenever Milo needed rest. Harold watched in amazement as Buddy seemed to develop a sixth sense for Milo's needs. The dog would position himself as a living crutch when Milo struggled to stand, offering his shoulder as support when the cub's legs gave out. During the coldest nights, Buddy would curl his body around Milo like a living furnace, sharing his warmth with a generosity that never seemed to diminish. Rusty, meanwhile, displayed the observational skills and protective instincts that would serve him well in the wild. The larger cub seemed constantly aware of his brother's condition, often positioning himself between Milo and potential hazards, with a protectiveness that reminded Harold of human siblings. When Milo stumbled, Rusty would be there to steady him with surprising gentleness for such a young animal. When food was scarce, Rusty would ensure Milo ate first, even pushing choice morsels toward his weaker brother with his tiny nose. The relationship between the two cubs fascinated Harold as much as their bond with Buddy. Despite their different temperaments, Rusty cautious and observant, Milo bold but fragile. They moved through the world as a unit, each compensating for the other's weaknesses while amplifying their strengths. It was as if they understood, on some fundamental level, that their survival depended not just on their individual abilities but on their capacity to function as a team. Evenings became Harold's favorite time, a period of peace and reflection that felt sacred in its simplicity. After the day's chores were complete and the cubs had been fed, he would settle at his old wooden table with journals and research books. Buddy would curl up at his feet, and the cubs would nestle together nearby, their small bodies creating a warm, golden bundle near the fireplace. The crackling of burning logs provided a gentle soundtrack to these quiet hours, and Harold would read aloud from his notebooks, sharing observations about animal behavior and wilderness ecology. At least I've got 3 little ones who listen to me ramble without wandering off or falling asleep, Harold would say, looking down at his attentive audience. The cub's ears would perk up at his voice, as if they understood the affection behind his words, while Buddy's tail would thump softly against the floor in response to the familiar evening ritual. Harold found himself sharing stories he'd never told another living soul, memories of his early days in the wilderness, observations about the changing seasons, theories about animal intelligence that he'd developed over decades of solitary study. The cubs would watch him with those remarkable amber eyes, their heads tilted in expressions of concentration that seemed almost human in their intensity. But the wilderness is unpredictable, and even the safest haven can be disrupted by nature's sudden fury. Harold had learned to read weather patterns with considerable accuracy, but some storms arrive with a ferocity that defies prediction. The tempest that struck on a Tuesday evening transformed the peaceful forest into a maelstrom of wind, rain, and lightning that seemed determined to tear the very mountains apart. The first crack of thunder sent both cubs scrambling for cover, their instincts recognizing the sound as a threat despite their youth and inexperience, while Rusty pressed himself against Buddy's side, seeking comfort in physical contact. Milo's reaction was pure panic, a terror so complete that it overrode all rational thought and sent him fleeing toward what his frightened mind perceived as safety. The smaller cub bolted through the cabin, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the wooden floors as he searched desperately for escape from the terrifying sounds assaulting his sensitive ears. Before Harold or Buddy could react, Milo had crashed through the barn door, a barrier that should have been strong enough to contain him, but which proved no match for panic. Fueled desperation and disappeared into the storm-lashed darkness. Harold's heart clenched with terror as he realized the magnitude of the danger. A young lion cub, disoriented and terrified, loose in a wilderness where every sound spelled potential death. It was a scenario that could end only in tragedy. The wind was howling like a living thing, bending trees nearly horizontal and turning the rain into stinging projectiles that made visibility almost impossible. Harold grabbed his flashlight and rain gear while Buddy headed straight for the door, his nose already working to pick up Milo's rapidly disappearing scent. Together, they plunged into the tempest, Harold's light beam barely penetrating the wall of rain that seemed determined to blind them. The forest had transformed into an alien landscape of thrashing shadows and deafening noise, where familiar landmarks became meaningless. And every step carried the risk of injury. For over an hour, they searched, following Buddy's instincts through terrain made treacherous by rain and wind. Harold's clothes were soaked through within minutes, his fingers numb with cold. But Buddy pressed on with single-minded determination. The dog's mournful howls cut through the storm, calling to the lost cub with a desperation that broke Harold's heart and reminded him that love creates its own form of courage. They found Milo wedged beneath a massive boulder, his small body shaking with cold and terror. Scratches covered his golden coat where thorns had caught him during his panicked flight, and mud matted his fur into spikes that made him look like a creature from nightmare, rather than the gentle soul Harold had come to know. But he was alive, and at the sight of Buddy and Harold, his frightened mules turned into purrs of relief. Harold scooped the cub into his arms, feeling the rapid flutter of Milo's heartbeat against his chest, like the wings of a trapped bird. Buddy immediately began his inspection, licking Milo's forehead and ears with gentle thoroughness, as if reassuring himself that his small charge was truly unharmed. The dog's tongue worked carefully around each scratch and cut, cleaning the wounds with an expertise that spoke of deep instinctual knowledge about healing and care. "You're okay now," Harold whispered to both of them, though he suspected Buddy's presence communicated the same message more effectively than any human words could manage. "We're all going home together." The journey back to the cabin was slow and careful, with Harold carrying the exhausted Milo, while Buddy maintained his protective vigil. Every few steps, the dog would press close to Harold's legs, as if ensuring that this time their family would remain intact. As the weeks passed, the bond between the unlikely family deepened in ways that continually amazed Harold and challenged his understanding of animal behavior. The cubs grew larger and stronger, but rather than growing apart from their canine guardian, they seemed to draw even closer to Buddy. The dog had become their anchor, their source of comfort and security. In a world that must have seemed impossibly strange and dangerous, Harold documented their development with scientific precision, noting the ways in which domestic dog behaviors influenced wild lion instincts and vice versa. He observed how Buddy's protective nature seemed to provide the cubs with confidence to explore their environment, while their natural feline behaviors appeared to awaken dormant hunting instincts in the dog. One afternoon, while setting up a camera trap to monitor local wildlife, Harold experienced firsthand the protective instincts his rescued cubs had developed toward their human caretaker. He was working near a steep ravine, focused on adjusting the camera angle to capture optimal footage. When his foot slipped on rain-dampened rock, Harold felt himself sliding toward the edge, gravity pulling him toward a 20-foot drop onto jagged stones below. Before he could react, Rusty appeared beside him with the fluid grace that was becoming his signature. The young lion, now weighing nearly 20 kilograms but still growing, planted himself between Harold and the ravine. The cub's low growl rumbled from deep in his chest as his eyes fixed on something moving in the brush below. Harold followed the gaze and spotted a black bear foraging among the rocks at the bottom of the ravine, a creature that might have shown considerable interest in an injured human. In that moment, looking into Rusty's amber eyes, Harold saw something that took his breath away and redefined his understanding of the bonds that can form between species. This wasn't just the protective instinct of a wild predator defending territory or asserting dominance. This was love deep, unconditional, and utterly devoted. Rusty was willing to face down a full-grown bear to protect the human who had saved his life. The realization struck Harold with the force of revelation, These cubs didn't see him as a temporary caretaker or convenient food source. They had accepted him as family, with all the fierce loyalty and protective instincts that such acceptance implied. In the space of a few weeks, he had become as precious to them as they were to him. Word of the unusual family had begun to spread through the local wildlife community. Despite Harold's attempts to maintain privacy and avoid the kind of attention that might threaten their peaceful existence, Karen Westbrook, a representative from the regional wildlife reserve, had heard rumors from hikers and hunters and eventually made contact. Dr. Michael Green, the local veterinarian, who had occasionally treated Buddy over the years, also became aware of the situation through the informal network of animal professionals who kept track of unusual cases rather than the hostile intervention Harold had feared. Both Karen and Dr. Green approached with scientific curiosity and genuine concern for the animal's welfare. They understood that they were dealing with something unprecedented, a situation that required careful observation rather than immediate action. Their first visit was tense, with Harold prepared to defend his unconventional family against any attempt at separation. But as Karen and Dr. Green observed the interactions between dog and cubs, watched Buddy's gentle care, and the cubs' obvious trust and affection, their professional skepticism gave way to wonder. "I've never seen anything like this," Karen admitted, watching as Milo used Buddy's tail to pull himself up from a lying position. "The behavioral adaptations on both sides are remarkable." Dr. Green nodded, making notes in his professional journal. "The cubs are developing normally in terms of physical growth, but their social behaviors are unlike anything in the literature on lion development." They began making regular visits, monitoring the cubs' development and health. While documenting their unprecedented living situation, Harold found their presence reassuring rather than threatening, as both professionals clearly understood the delicate nature of what they were observing. During one particularly warm afternoon visit, Milo suffered a mild seizure, brought on by a fever, a frightening episode that demonstrated once again the depth of the bond between dog and cubs. Harold watched in helpless concern as the small cub's body convulsed, his limbs twitching uncontrollably while his eyes rolled back in his head. Before either Harold or Dr. Green could react, Buddy was there. The dog pressed his body gently against Milo's trembling form, his whimpers soft and rhythmic, like a lullaby. The vibration of Buddy's body seemed to have a calming effect, and his warm presence provided both physical comfort and emotional security during the frightening episode. Karen knelt beside them, monitoring Milo's vital signs while Buddy maintained his protective position. She watched in amazement as the dog's instinctive response proved more effective than any medical intervention might have been. The tremors gradually subsided, and Milo's breathing returned to normal. But Buddy remained pressed against him until the cub was fully recovered. Karen said nothing in the moment, but Harold noticed tears in her eyes as she watched the interaction between dog and cub. Later, she confided that in 20 years of wildlife management, she had never witnessed such sophisticated interspecies caregiving. When Karen returned the following week, she brought a bag of high-quality meat treats, enough for all three animals. Her gesture spoke volumes about how the unusual family had touched even the most professional hearts, breaking down the barriers between scientific objectivity and emotional connection. But not all visitors came with such benevolent intentions. The crisis Harold had long dreaded arrived on a crisp autumn morning when a team from the State Wildlife Center appeared at his door. Without warning, they carried official documents and transport cages. Their intention clear and non-negotiable. Rusty and Milo were to be removed immediately for placement in a proper wildlife facility where they could receive appropriate care from qualified professionals. Harold had prepared for this moment during countless sleepless nights, but seeing the reality of separation made his chest tighten with anxiety and his hands shake with suppressed emotion. These weren't just animals he had rescued, they were family members. Creatures who had become as precious to him as any human relationship he'd ever known. Buddy seemed to sense the threat immediately. demonstrating once again his remarkable ability to read human emotions and intentions. The dog positioned himself between the officials and the cubs, his stance protective, but not aggressive. His message was clear without being confrontational. These cubs were under his protection, and any attempt to separate them would have to go through him first. Harold opened his journals, spreading months of careful documentation across his kitchen table, with the precision of a lawyer presenting evidence in a crucial case. Photographs showed the cubs' development, videos captured their interactions with Buddy, and detailed notes tracked their health, behavior, and emotional growth. He presented his case with quiet determination, knowing that their future depended on his ability to convince these officials that what they were witnessing was not a dangerous whim, but a scientifically significant phenomenon. "I don't want to keep them forever," Harold said, meeting each official's eyes in turn. "But if you take them now, before they're ready, they'll never be whole lions. They need this time to develop properly, to learn from Buddy what they can't learn in captivity." The team leader, a stern woman named Dr. Patricia Hoffman, reviewed Harold's documentation with professional skepticism that gradually gave way to genuine interest as she watched video footage of Buddy teaching the cubs to hunt insects, of the three animals sleeping peacefully together, of Rusty protecting Harold at the ravine. Her expression softened and her questions became more curious than confrontational. Dr. Hoffman was particularly intrigued by footage showing the cubs' development of hunting behaviors under Buddy's inadvertent tutelage. The dog's natural prey drive, modified by his domestic training, seemed to be teaching the cubs stalking techniques that combined wild instincts with learned patience and precision. After a tense hour of discussion, compromise was reached through the intervention of Karen and Dr. Green, who testified to the unique value of what Harold was documenting. Rusty and Milo would be granted 6 additional months under Harold's care, officially designated as a transitional behavioral monitoring period. Harold would continue his documentation while working with the Wildlife Center to prepare for the cubs' eventual reintegration with their own species. The agreement came with strict conditions, regular veterinary checkups, detailed behavioral reports, and immediate intervention if the cubs showed signs of stress or developmental problems. Harold accepted these terms gladly, knowing that he had won precious time to help his adopted family prepare for the inevitable transition to independence. As the months progressed toward the deadline, subtle changes began to manifest in the cubs' behavior that both thrilled and saddened Harold. At sunset, Rusty and Milo would often position themselves at the edge of the cleared area around Harold's cabin, their ears perked toward the forest. With an intensity that spoke of awakening instincts, soft growls would rumble from their throats, not threatening, but communicative, as if they were responding to calls that only they could hear. Their eyes tracked movements and sounds that Harold's human senses couldn't detect, and their posture took on the alert readiness of wild predators becoming aware of their true nature. Harold documented these changes with mixed emotions, recognizing them as signs of healthy development while mourning the approaching end of their time together. Buddy noticed these changes too, demonstrating once again his remarkable sensitivity to the emotional currents of his adopted family. The dog who had once chased after the cubs when they wandered too far now simply watched from his position near the cabin, his expression carrying a quality Harold could only describe as knowing acceptance. It was as if Buddy understood that his charges were beginning to hear calls he could not answer, and that his role as their protector would soon give way to their need for independence. The official evaluation period culminated in a special meeting of wildlife experts from across the region, a gathering that transformed Harold's simple cabin into a temporary conference center. Harold presented his complete documentation, 6 months of detailed observations, health records, behavioral analysis, and photographic evidence that told the story of an unprecedented interspecies bond. Karen contributed her professional assessment of the cubs' development, noting their remarkable physical health and the sophisticated social behaviors they had learned from their canine guardian. Dr. Green provided comprehensive health evaluations that demonstrated the cubs' readiness for life in the wild, while acknowledging the unique advantages their unusual upbringing had provided. The conclusion was unanimous. Both Rusty and Milo displayed complete predatory orientation and instinctual behaviors appropriate for their species and age. They were deemed ready for semi-controlled, rewilding, a gradual reintroduction process that would allow them to join their own kind while maintaining safety protocols and continued monitoring. The farewell day arrived with the melancholy beauty of late autumn, when the forest dressed itself in brilliant colors that seemed designed to make every moment more poignant. Frost silvered the grass around Harold's cabin, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach. Harold felt as though his chest contained a stone, heavy and cold. But he knew this day had always been inevitable, written into the very nature of the relationship, from the moment he first held two tiny cubs in his shaking hands. He said nothing as he led Buddy and the two lions along the familiar trail toward the forest's edge, where the reserve gate stood open like a portal between worlds. The walk passed in silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant calls of wild birds preparing for winter migration. Each step felt simultaneously too fast and too slow, bringing them closer to a separation that was both necessary and heartbreaking. Dr. Green waited at the gate, his expression solemn but supportive. Understanding the magnitude of what was about to occur, he knelt to pat Buddy's head, then placed a firm hand on Harold's shoulder. No words were exchanged. This moment carried weight that transcended language, the kind of farewell that changes everyone involved. As Harold turned to begin the journey back to his suddenly empty cabin, he glanced over his shoulder one final time. In the damp earth beside the gate, 3 sets of paw prints were pressed into the mud. Buddy's broad pads, Rusty's larger cat prints, and Milo's smaller but perfectly formed tracks. The prints seemed to fade into the morning mist, becoming ghostly impressions that might have been imagined if not for their perfect clarity in the soft earth. Harold pulled out his camera and captured the image, knowing that this photograph would become one of his most treasured possessions. That evening, writing in his journal by lamplight, he struggled to find words for the emotions churning in his chest. Finally, he wrote simply, "No blood shared, just love." The months that followed were the loneliest Harold had experienced since moving to the wilderness decades earlier. Buddy seemed to age overnight, spending long hours lying on the porch, his eyes fixed on the forest edge, with an intensity that spoke of hope and sorrow. Combined, the cabin felt too large, too quiet, too empty without the presence of young life and the sounds of play that had filled it for so many months. Winter settled over the mountains with unusual severity that year, bringing heavy snows and bitter temperatures that seemed designed to match the emotional climate of Harold's solitary existence. He and Buddy maintained their routines, but both moved through their days with a listlessness that spoke of hearts waiting for something they might never see again. Harold found himself pausing in his daily activities to listen for sounds that never came: the soft padding of paws on the cabin floor, the contented purring of cubs at rest, the gentle games that had once filled his evenings with joy. Even his journal entries became sparse, as if the departure of the cubs had taken with them the inspiration that had driven his careful documentation of their extraordinary relationship. Then came an afternoon in early winter when everything changed, when the impossible became reality in a moment that redefined Harold's understanding of love, memory, and the bonds that transcend all boundaries. Harold was kneeling before the fireplace, arranging kindling for the evening fire with the mechanical precision of routine, when Buddy suddenly sat upright. The dog's ears twitched forward, his body tense with attention, his entire being focused on something Harold couldn't perceive. Harold followed Buddy's gaze toward the tree line and felt his breath catch in his throat, his heart stopping for one impossible moment before resuming with thunderous intensity. 2 golden silhouettes emerged from the forest edge, moving with the fluid grace of apex predators who had learned to own their power. They were larger now, their bodies filled out with muscle and wild confidence, their movements carrying the deadly precision of creatures born to hunt. But their eyes, those amber eyes that had watched him with such trust during their months together, could never be mistaken for any others. Rusty and Milo approached slowly, their movements respectful but unafraid, demonstrating the perfect balance between wild caution and remembered affection. They had grown magnificent in their months of freedom, their coats gleaming with health, their bearing regal and confident. Yet as they drew near, their expressions softened with recognition and unmistakable joy. They settled on either side of Buddy, their larger frames dwarfing their canine guardian, but their behavior unchanged from the days when they had been tiny cubs, seeking warmth and protection. No words were spoken, no explanations offered or needed. The three animals curled together beneath Harold's ancient oak tree, as if they had never been apart, as if the months of separation had been nothing more than a brief interruption in an eternal bond. Harold watched from his porch, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, as the impossible reunion unfolded before him. These were wild lions now, capable of surviving independently in their natural habitat, rulers of their territory and masters of their destiny. They had learned to hunt, to compete, to claim their place in the ecosystem, with all the fierce pride of their species. Yet they had remembered love, remembered home, remembered the dog who had saved their lives and the man who had given them shelter when they needed it most. From that winter afternoon forward, Rusty and Milo returned every year on the same date, at precisely the same hour. With a punctuality that defied rational explanation, Harold never understood how they kept such perfect timing, how they navigated back to this specific place from wherever their wild lives took them. No GPS guided them, no human schedule constrained them, no external force compelled their return. Yet their arrival became as reliable as the changing seasons, as predictable as sunrise and sunset. Each visit lasted exactly the same length of time, 3 hours, during which the reunited family would rest together, sharing warmth and presence, without need for more complex communication. They would lie beneath the oak tree, sometimes grooming each other, sometimes simply basking in the comfort of physical proximity, their breathing synchronized as it had been during those first precious nights, when they were all learning what it meant to be a family. Then, as if responding to some internal clock that only they could hear, the lions would rise, touch noses with Buddy in a farewell that never failed to move Harold to tears, and disappear back into the forest until the following year. Their departure was always gentle, never hurried, carrying with it the promise of return that made the separation bearable. Harold documented these visits meticulously, sharing his findings with Karen and Dr. Green, who were amazed by the consistency and apparent intentionality of the lion's behavior. Scientific literature contained no comparable cases of wild animals maintaining such precise contact with their adoptive families, making Harold's documentation invaluable to researchers studying animal cognition and emotional intelligence. But for Harold, the scientific implications mattered less than the simple miracle of love, transcending species barriers, distance, and time itself. Every year, as he watched 3 unlikely family members curl together beneath the oak tree, he was reminded that some bonds exist beyond human understanding or explanation, connections so profound they reshape the very nature of what seems possible in the natural world. Years passed, and Harold's hair grew whiter, Buddy's muzzle grayed with age, and the lions grew into magnificent examples of their species, their presence commanding respect throughout their territory. Yet their annual reunion remained unchanged, a constant. In a world of flux and uncertainty, proof that some promises transcend the limitations of language and species, neighbors sometimes asked Harold to explain the phenomenon, to provide rational theories about animal behavior and pack bonding that might make sense of what they were witnessing. He would smile and offer the only explanation that mattered: the truth that had sustained him through decades of wilderness living love, never forgets the way home. On quiet evenings, as Harold sat by his fireplace, with Buddy resting at his feet, he would often think about the night that started it all, the storm, the frantic barking, the discovery of two tiny lives hanging in the balance. He had thought he was simply rescuing animals in distress, performing the kind of wilderness mercy that any decent person would offer. Instead, he had become part of something larger, a testament to the possibility of love, without conditions, family without genetics, home without walls. The forest around Harold's cabin continued its endless cycle of seasons, but within that cycle, one constant remained that gave meaning to all the rest. Every winter afternoon, at precisely the same time, three figures would gather beneath an ancient oak tree, proving that some bonds transcend time, distance, and the supposed limitations of the natural world. No one had taught them to remember. No one had called them home. But love, as Harold had discovered in the most profound way possible, never forgets the way back to where it began.